This has already happened, and it's happening again. Every 12,000 years, civilization is erased down to silence. And the evidence says we're standing at the exact reset point right now. If the last advanced world saw this coming and still failed, what chance do we really have? On a clay tablet excavated from the ruins of Nippur, one of the oldest cities ever discovered, scribes recorded a list of kings whose reigns stretched back tens of thousands of years before the flood. Not hundreds of years, tens of thousands. The tablet does not read like myth. It reads like a chronicle, calm, administrative, untroubled by its own impossibility. The Sumerians wrote it down. The Akkadians copied it. The Babylonians preserved it. And somewhere inside that document, buried beneath the arithmetic of impossibly long reigns, us is a structural claim so persistent it keeps appearing in culture after culture, continent after continent, that before now there was another world, and it ended. But this is where the story stops being comfortable. Modern geology does not support a divine reset. No physical mechanism fires every 12,000 years on schedule. Orbital cycles, the slow wobble and tilt of Earth's axis, operate over 23,000, 41,000, and 100,000 year spans. Not 12,000. The number has no cosmic authority. And yet, something did happen, not on a schedule, but suddenly, measurably, violently enough to be encoded in ice cores drilled from 2 kilometers beneath the Greenland surface, in dust layers pressed into ancient lake beds, in pollen records locked inside cave formations across 4 continents. And the evidence is not folklore. It is stratigraphy, chemistry, annual layers of atmosphere frozen in sequence, readable like a diary of the sky. So here is the question that will carry us through tonight. And it is not the question you came in with. Not, does civilization reset every 12,000 years? But this, why do complex civilizations, ones with writing, trade, astronomy, and monumental architecture, keep collapsing? And are we, with our satellites and supply chains and global financial networks, building something more resilient than they did? Or something more fragile? The answer is scattered across the globe. It is pressed into the layered sediment of Greenland ice cores. It is carved into limestone pillars that hunter-gatherers built before they knew how to farm. It is submerged beneath the North Sea and the Persian Gulf and the shallow waters of Southeast Asia, where entire human landscapes now sit 60 to 100 meters below the surface. It is written in the archaeological record of a civilization, the Bronze Age world, that controlled half the known Earth and collapsed within a single generation. Tonight, we travel backward. Not centuries, millennia. We will walk through the science of Earth's most documented climate shock. We will stand inside the ruins of cultures that collapsed not because the stars demanded it, but because their systems could not bend. We will examine what the oldest human settlements on the planet actually tell us. and what the ocean has been quietly hiding about our own origins. I will tell you what is established, what is actively debated, and what remains genuinely unknown. Well, this is not a story about prophecy. It is a story about pattern, and about the difference between a cycle and a warning. That distinction will matter more by the end than it does right now. Hold on to it. Now, let the day settle. Let whatever you carried in here rest for a moment. You do not need visuals for this. The evidence is old enough that no image could do it justice anyway. What you need is patience. The same patience it took for ice to record 12,900 years of atmosphere, one winter at a time. If this kind of slow, evidence-grounded journey through deep history is what you come here for, a quiet like or comment helps other people find it. And if you want to, leave a word about where in the world you're listening from tonight. Oh, there is something quietly remarkable about that. People in dozens of time zones, separated by thousands of kilometers, all drifting through the same ancient questions at the same hour. Now, let us go back. Roughly 12,900 years ago, the planet was in the middle of something that had not happened in tens of thousands of years. It was warming. The last great ice age, which had locked the northern hemisphere under glaciers sometimes kilometers thick, was finally releasing its hold. Coastlines that had been frozen for longer than recorded history were becoming accessible. Ice sheets across Canada and Scandinavia were retreating. Sea levels were rising, slowly but steadily, as meltwater returned to the oceans. And with that warming came life. And forests spread northward into territories that had been tundra for millennia. Animal herds followed, and human communities, mobile, adaptive, resourceful, followed the herds. They were moving into the newly thawed landscapes of northern Europe. They were settling the vast coastal plains of Southeast Asia, where lower sea levels had exposed enormous stretches of land now submerged, a region geologists call the Sundar Shelf, connecting islands that today sit separated by deep ocean water. They were living in what is now the Persian Gulf Basin, which was not a gulf at all then, but a fertile river valley, green and inhabited, fed by rivers running to a sea that had not yet risen to swallow it. These were not primitive people in the way the word is usually meant. They were burying their dead with deliberate care. They were tracking animal migrations across hundreds of kilometers. They were painting images onto cave walls with a sophistication that still stops art historians cold. They were trading materials, obsidian, ochre, shell, across distances that imply networks of communication and trust. They were, in every way that matters, us. And the future, for the first time in a very long time, felt like it was opening. Then, without warning, it closed. Within decades, possibly within years, based on the resolution of Greenland ice core data, temperatures across the North Atlantic region dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. Not over centuries, within a human lifetime, perhaps within the memory of a single generation. The glaciers stopped retreating. In some regions, they advanced again. Rivers froze. And forests that had spent centuries establishing themselves began to die. The animals that had moved north found their range collapsing, and the human communities that had followed them into newly habitable territory found themselves caught between a returning cold and coastlines that, despite the freeze, were still rising, driven by the momentum of meltwater already released. This was the Younger Dryas, named for a small white wildflower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen reappeared in European lake sediments at precisely this moment, marking the return of Arctic conditions to places that had briefly been green. It lasted approximately 1,200 years, and it is not speculation. It is one of the most thoroughly documented climate events in Earth's geological record, confirmed by ice cores, ocean sediments, cave formations, and lakebed chemistry across multiple continents and hemispheres. The world that had been opening closed, and the people who had been expanding into it were forced to make a choice that does not appear in any text, but that echoes through everything that came after. Adapt, migrate, or disappear. What happened next is where the real story begins. The Younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it began. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures across the North Atlantic climbed by roughly 10 degrees Celsius, not over centuries, but within decades. The ice retreated again, this time for good. The coastlines that had briefly refrozen began their long, final rise, and the humans who had endured 1,200 years of unexpected cold emerged into a world that was, once again, opening. What they built next, and what they remembered, is where the 12,000-year idea was born. Not in geology, in human memory. Every civilization that has reflected on its own origins has imagined a world before this one. That is not an exaggeration. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the entire cross-cultural record. The ancient Greeks described 4 ages of humanity, each ending in catastrophe. The Maya tracked not one creation, but 5, each previous sun destroyed, each world reset by a different force. Hindu cosmology articulates repeating yugas, vast cycles of cosmic time in which civilizations rise, exhaust themselves, and dissolve. The Norse described Ragnarok, a final battle, a drowning world, and a green earth rising afterward from the sea. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, among the oldest continuously maintained knowledge systems on the planet, preserve detailed geographic memories of coastlines that have been underwater for more than 7,000 years. These are not the same story. They are different stories, from different languages, different hemispheres, different cosmologies, all independently arriving at the same structural idea, that the world we live in is not the first one. That pattern deserves to be taken seriously, not as prophecy, but as a question about what human memory actually preserves and how. Here is where the seduction enters. Measure the distance between the end of the last ice age and today. Roughly 12,000 12,000 years. Or then notice that so many ancient traditions seem to be looking back toward exactly that horizon, toward a time of catastrophe, transformation, and beginning. The number feels like it means something. It feels like a clock. But chronologies do not support that feeling. Earth's orbital cycles, the Milankovitch cycles that govern long-term climate shifts, operate on timescales of 23,000, 41,000, and 100,000 years. These are real, measurable, and well documented. There is no corresponding orbital mechanism that fires every 12,000 years. No planetary alignment, no galactic pulse, no geological timer. The number has emotional resonance because it maps onto the edge of living cultural memory. It does not have physical authority. And this is the point where most treatments of this subject stop, either to claim conspiracy or to dismiss the entire question as wishful pattern matching. Both responses miss what the evidence is actually showing. Humans are, by design, pattern-seeking. That capacity is not a flaw. It is what allowed communities to survive ice ages, track animal migrations across thousands of kilometers, and read weather in cloud formations before there were instruments to measure it. The ability to find signal inside noise kept people alive. But that same capacity produces a specific and well-documented error, perceiving cycles where there are only clusters, seeing rhythm where there is only recurrence. Civilizations have collapsed many times. Climate has shifted many times. Coastlines have drowned. Cultures have fractured. And survivors have rebuilt repeatedly across thousands of years and dozens of regions. When those events are remembered and transmitted across generations, they begin to feel like a pattern with a period, a rhythm, a clock. The 12,000-year idea persists not because science supports it, but because something real happened near that boundary, something violent enough to reshape ecosystems across multiple continents, something sudden enough to displace cultures that had been expanding for generations, something powerful enough to echo through myth for longer than most nations have existed. That event has a name, a documented mechanism, and a precise stratigraphic signature in the geological record. We have already met it. What we have not yet asked is the question it actually raises, not about cosmic cycles, but about the societies that survived it, and the ones that did not. If there is no cosmic reset clock, no celestial mechanism targeting 12,000-year intervals, then something else produced the shock. Something internal to Earth's own climate system. Something that required no external trigger. And if it happened without warning once, in a world far less interconnected than ours, the relevant question is not whether it is scheduled to happen again. The relevant question is what it actually did to the people living through it, and whether the choices they made in the aftermath look familiar. Somewhere in central Greenland, there is a column of ice that has never been touched by sunlight. It was drilled from 2 kilometers beneath the surface, extracted in sections, labeled, and stored at temperatures cold enough to preserve what it contains, a continuous record of Earth's atmosphere stretching back more than 100,000 years. Every winter that ever fell on Greenland left a layer. Every volcanic eruption, every dust storm, every shift in ocean chemistry left a chemical signature, pressed into annual bands as readable as tree rings. Scientists call these cores GIS P2 and GRIP. What they found inside them forced a quiet but significant revision of how climate science understood the stability of Earth's systems. The assumption, before these cores were analyzed in detail, was that large-scale climate change was slow, gradual, the kind of shift that unfolded over thousands of years, giving ecosystems, and the species within them, time to adapt. The ice said otherwise. At the boundary marking 12,900 years ago, the chemical layers shift, with an abruptness that initially seemed like a measurement error. Dust concentrations spike. Oxygen isotope ratios, which function as a precise thermometer of past atmospheric temperatures, drop sharply. The change does not spread across centuries. It compresses into decades. In some layers, the transition appears to resolve within as few as 3 annual deposits. 3 years. A climate system serving an entire hemisphere, reorganizing within a span that a single person could witness from childhood to early adulthood. The mechanism most supported by current research involves the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the vast conveyor of ocean currents that transports warm tropical water northward and returns cold deep water southward. This system acts as a heat distribution network for the entire North Atlantic region. As the preceding ice age ended, glaciers melted. That meltwater, cold and critically fresh, poured into the North Atlantic in quantities large enough to disrupt the salinity balance the circulation depends on. Salt water sinks. Fresh water does not. When enough fresh meltwater entered the system, the circulation slowed or possibly stalled. The warm water stopped arriving. The North Atlantic cooled, and the cooling spread. What followed was not a gradual transition. Temperatures across the region dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, a shift comparable to the difference between a temperate forest climate and an Arctic one. And they did so faster than any previous large-scale climate change in the record. Cave formations in Ireland, lake sediments in Switzerland, ocean cores from the North Atlantic floor, and pollen records from across northern Europe all confirm the same sequence, independently, from their own chemical languages. This was not a regional anomaly. It was a planetary reorganization. And here is where the ice core data becomes genuinely unsettling. The Younger Dryas lasted approximately 1,200 years. That number is long enough to feel abstract, long enough to assume that what followed must have been slow adaptation, gradual adjustment, and the patient work of survival across generations. But 1,200 years after the initial cooling, the system flipped again. Temperatures rebounded, by some measures, rising as sharply as the original fall. The Holocene began. the ice retreated permanently, the world stabilized into the climate regime that has supported every agricultural civilization, every city, every recorded dynasty in human history. The entire episode, a sudden freeze lasting over a millennium, followed by an equally sudden thaw, sits inside the geological record as cleanly as a parenthesis. What that parenthesis contained, for the human communities living through it, is a different question entirely. Those communities had been moving, expanding into territories made newly accessible by the retreating ice, building the kind of distributed, mobile knowledge that allowed navigation across unfamiliar landscapes. And then, the corridors they had learned to move through began to close. The food webs that had reorganized around warming conditions began to collapse. The stability that had allowed expansion was withdrawn, not over lifetimes, but within one. The ice core records what happened to the atmosphere with extraordinary precision. They do not record what happened to the people. That evidence is kept somewhere else entirely, and most of it is no longer on dry land. Around 12,800 years ago, the largest land animals in the Western Hemisphere disappeared. Not gradually, not continent by continent over millions of years, the way paleontologists describe most extinction events. Within a geologically narrow window, a span measured in centuries rather than epochs, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, American horses, and camels vanished from a continent they had inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years. The timing is not coincidental. It sits almost precisely at the boundary of the Younger Dryas. What caused it has never been fully resolved, and the debate itself reveals something important about how collapse actually works. The two leading explanations have spent decades competing for primacy. The first is climate, that the rapid environmental disruption of the Younger Dryas destabilized the ecosystems these animals depended on, shrinking ranges, fragmenting food supplies, and driving population crashes that hunting pressure then finished. The second is human arrival, that the Clovis people, the earliest well-documented culture in North America, hunted megafauna that had never encountered human predators and therefore had no instinct to fear them. Both explanations are supported by evidence. Neither fully accounts for the pattern alone. What most current research suggests is a combination, not one cause overwhelming a stable system, but two pressures arriving simultaneously on a system already under stress. Climate contraction removed the margin. Human hunting removed the remainder. The mechanism matters less than the outcome. In a span of time short enough to fall within living cultural memory, the ecological architecture of an entire continent was structured. The animals that had shaped migration patterns, maintained grassland ecosystems, and provided reliable protein across enormous distances were gone. And the cultures that had organized themselves around those animals were forced to reorganize as well. The Clovis culture, defined by a distinctive style of fluted stone point found at sites across North America, effectively disappears from the archaeological record around 12,800 years ago. Not gradually. The signature simply stops appearing with any consistency. What replaced it was not absence, but fragmentation. Smaller, more regionally distinct tool traditions emerge in the archaeological layers that follow, each adapted to local conditions, local prey, local plant communities. On the broad continental network that Clovis points imply a shared technological tradition spanning thousands of kilometers, gives way to something more localized, more varied, and considerably harder to trace. This is the pattern that runs beneath every major disruption in the prehistoric record. Collapse is not the end of people. It is the end of a particular way of organizing people. The communities survive. The system that connected them does not. Collapse is local. Memory is global. And here is where the chapter quietly breaks in half. While ecosystems were reorganizing on land and cultures were fragmenting into regional adaptations, the ocean was moving. Not at the pace of geological time, at a pace that people standing on coastlines could observe within their own lives. A meltwater pulse, 1A, a well-documented episode of accelerated sea level rise, is estimated by marine geologists to have raised global sea levels by somewhere between 16 and 25 meters within a span of roughly 500 years. Some models compress the most intense phase into significantly less. The precise rate remains debated, but the physical evidence in ocean sediment cores in drowned coral reefs now sitting tens of meters below the surface is not. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years moved inland. In some regions, they moved by hundreds of kilometers. The fertile coastal plains, river valleys, and estuaries where human populations had concentrated, because coastlines are where fresh water, marine resources, and terrestrial hunting overlap, were submerged, not metaphorically, physically, permanently. The land that was lost did not disappear slowly enough for the people on it to simply walk away without consequence. It disappeared within the span of communities, within the memory of families, which means the people dispersed, inland, upland, into territories already occupied by other groups, into landscapes that required entirely new knowledge to survive. Where they went, and what they carried with them, is a question the land can no longer answer. But, in certain places, stone can. There is a landscape beneath the North Sea that no living person has ever walked across. It has rivers, it has valleys, it has the sedimentary signatures of forests, wetlands, and lake beds, the kind of terrain that, in any other context, would be described as exceptionally fertile, exceptionally habitable, exceptionally well suited to supporting large and stable human populations. It is sitting under roughly 40 to 60 meters of ocean water. It has been there for approximately 8,000 years. Geologists call it Doggerland. For most of recorded history, no one knew it existed. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 21,000 years ago, global sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. That number is worth sitting with. 120 meters is not a minor fluctuation. It is the difference between the world as it currently exists and a world where the continental shelves of every ocean are exposed land, where Britain is not an island but a peninsula attached to continental Europe, where the shallow seas between the Indonesian archipelago are a single connected landmass larger than India, where the Persian Gulf is a river valley running green and inhabited between its banks. These were not marginal environments on the edges of the habitable world. They were its center. Coastal plains and river valleys concentrate the overlap between fresh water, marine resources, and terrestrial hunting in ways that interior landscapes cannot match. They are, by any ecological measure, exactly where human populations preferentially settle, and essentially all of them are now underwater. Doggerland, the submerged plain connecting Britain to continental Europe, was inhabited for thousands of years before the sea claimed it. Fishing nets dragging the North Sea floor have pulled up Mesolithic tools, animal bones, and on at least one documented occasion, a barbed antler point of the kind used for spearing fish in shallow water. These objects were not deposited by flooding. They were left by people living on dry land, going about the ordinary business of daily life, in a place that no longer exists above the waterline. The Sunda Shelf, off the coast of Southeast Asia, tells a parallel story. At glacial maximum, it formed a continuous landmass, called Sundaland by researchers, connecting what are now the islands of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula into a single territory. Genetic studies of present-day Southeast Asian populations carry signatures consistent with a large, connected ancestral population subsequently fragmented by rising seas. The people did not move. The water moved around them. The Persian Gulf Basin, similarly, was a habitable river valley for much of the period we have been discussing, fed by the combined flow of the Tigris and Euphrates long before those rivers reached any sea. When sea levels rose and the Indian Ocean pushed northward through the Strait of Hormuz, it did so over centuries, gradually, then irreversibly. This is the midpoint at which the conventional timeline of human civilization quietly become difficult to defend. The standard narrative places the origins of complex human organization in the period following 10,000 years ago, after the Younger Dryas, after the Holocene began, after agriculture emerged in the Fertile Crescent and monumental construction appeared in the archaeological record. The implication, rarely stated directly but structurally embedded in most accounts, is that this is roughly when meaningful complexity began, but the prime habitats of Ice Age humanity are not available for excavation. They are underwater. The absence of evidence from those landscapes is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of submersion. We are reading a record from which the majority of the relevant chapters have been physically removed from our reach. Civilization did not appear suddenly around 10,000 years ago. Its earlier chapters simply ended up somewhere archaeologists cannot yet go. What survives on dry land from that transitional period is therefore not a complete picture. It is whatever managed to persist above the waterline, in highlands, in interior regions, in places that were secondary habitats during the Ice Age, unpopulated precisely because people had been displaced from somewhere better. The reorganization that followed the Younger Dryas and the coastal drownings that accompanied it did not leave behind ruins in the conventional sense. It left behind something stranger, and in some ways more difficult to explain. In the highlands of southeastern Turkey, on a limestone ridge overlooking what is now an arid plateau, there are stone pillars that should not exist. Not because their existence is impossible, but because everything we thought we understood about the sequence of human development says they should have come much later, if they should have come at all. They were not built by a civilization with cities. They were not built by farmers with surplus grain to fund large labor projects. Yet they were not built by a state with administrators, tax records, and organized conscription. They were built by hunter-gatherers, people with no permanent settlements, no domesticated crops, no written language. People who, according to the model of civilizational development that archaeology held confidently for most of the 20th century, should not yet have been capable of coordinating the kind of labor this required. The site is called Gobekli Tepe. It has been dated to approximately 9,600 years before our era, and it has not finished dismantling assumptions. The structures themselves are not modest. T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing up to 6 meters tall and weighing between 10 and 20 metric tons, were quarried, shaped, transported, and erected in circular arrangements across multiple enclosures on the ridge. The pillars are not rough or approximate. They are worked with precision. Their surfaces carry carved reliefs of animals, foxes, vultures, scorpions, cranes, wild boar, rendered with an attention to anatomical detail that implies not casual decoration, but deliberate symbolic intention. No mortar was used. No metal tools were available. The labor required to extract these stones from bedrock, move them across uneven terrain, and raise them into position has been estimated, conservatively, as requiring the coordinated effort of hundreds of people over extended periods. Those people had to be fed, organized, and directed toward a shared purpose. Without agriculture, without stored surplus, without any of the infrastructure that the Standard Model insisted was a prerequisite for this kind of organized complexity. The discovery of Gobekli Tepe did not merely add a data point to the archaeological record. It inverted a sequence that had been treated as foundational. The old model ran in one direction. Agriculture produces surplus. Surplus enables specialization. Specialization produces cities. Cities produce temples. Ritual complexity was understood as a downstream product of economic development. Gobekli Tepe suggests the sequence may have operated in reverse, or at minimum that it was not a sequence at all. That ritual coordination, shared symbolic purpose, and the organizational demands of monumental construction may have been drivers of settled behavior, not products of it. Whilst that the need to return repeatedly to a sacred site, to maintain it, expand it, feed the people working on it, may itself have created the conditions from which agriculture eventually emerged nearby. The evidence for early cultivation in the surrounding region appears in the archaeological layers that follow Gobekli Tepe's construction, not before it. And here is the detail that tends to alter the shape of the entire story. Gobekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was buried, deliberately. The enclosures were filled in with stone rubble and soil in a controlled, intentional process. Whoever built it also chose to conceal it, to seal it beneath the earth as if interring something that had served its purpose, or that needed to be protected from something approaching. We do not know why. The burial itself left no inscription, and no explanation, no record of intent that survives. Only the act, preserved in the stratigraphy, legible to excavators thousands of years later as a conscious decision. Something ended at Gobekli Tepe. Something was put away. What this means for the broader question of civilizational resilience is uncomfortable to sit with. If the communities that emerged from the Younger Dryas disruption, displaced, fragmented, stripped of their coastal habitats, were capable of reorganizing into something sophisticated enough to produce Gobekli Tepe within roughly 2,000 years of the shock, then the human capacity for rebuilding after catastrophe is not in question. The question is different, and it is harder, because the civilizations that came after, larger, more connected, are more technically sophisticated than anything Gobekli Tepe implies, did not survive either. Around 3,200 years ago, someone sent a letter that was never answered. It was written in cuneiform on a clay tablet, dispatched from the king of Ugarit, one of the most prosperous trading cities in the ancient Mediterranean, to the king of Alashia, believed to be located on Cyprus. The letter describes enemy ships appearing offshore. It describes the city's army being absent, deployed elsewhere. It describes a situation deteriorating faster than messengers can carry word of it. The tablet was found in a kiln in Ugarit, still unbaked. It had never been sent. Shortly after it was composed, Ugarit ceased to exist as an inhabited city. It was not rebuilt. It was not resettled. It was simply abandoned. And the sand covered it for 3,000 years. That undelivered letter is one of the last things the city ever produced. What happened across the eastern Mediterranean between approximately 1200 and 1150 years before our era remains one of the most studied and least fully explained episodes in the entire ancient record. Within the span of roughly 50 years, a single human lifetime, the Mycenaean palace system collapsed. The Hittite Empire, which had contested Egypt for dominance of the Near East and signed one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in recorded history, ceased to exist entirely. The new kingdom of Egypt survived, but contracted sharply, losing its territories in Canaan and never fully recovering its prior reach. Dozens of cities across Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Cyprus were destroyed, abandoned, or sharply depopulated. The Bronze Age world, which had spent centuries building one of the most sophisticated international trade systems the ancient world had ever produced, came apart within a single generation. The trade network itself is critical to understanding what followed, because it is what made the civilization vulnerable in ways that smaller, less connected societies were not. Bronze, the defining material of the age, used for tools, weapons, and the agricultural implements that supported urban food supplies, required two materials that almost nowhere in the Mediterranean occurred together: copper and tin. Copper came primarily from Cyprus. Tin came from sources as distant as Afghanistan and possibly Cornwall. And the palaces that distributed bronze goods across the region were not manufacturing centers in any self-sufficient sense. They were nodes in a supply chain that stretched thousands of kilometers and depended on the continuous functioning of maritime trade routes, diplomatic relationships, and political stability across multiple independent kingdoms simultaneously. When any part of that chain failed, the failure did not stay local. Pollen records, tree ring chronologies, and isotope analysis from lake sediments across the eastern Mediterranean now provide evidence for a prolonged drought event beginning around 1200 years before our era, a multi-decade reduction in rainfall affecting grain yields across the region simultaneously. On letters recovered from the Egyptian and Hittite archives in the period immediately preceding the collapse, contain repeated references to food shortages, requests for grain shipments, and warnings about populations destabilized by hunger. Climate stress did not cause the collapse by itself, but it arrived on top of a system that had optimized itself for efficiency rather than resilience, one that had, over centuries of stability, removed the redundancies and local self-sufficiency that might have allowed individual nodes to survive the failure of others. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu, carved into the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Thebes, describe the arrival of the Sea Peoples, migrating groups pressing into Egypt from the north and west, in terms that suggest displaced populations moving under pressure, not organized armies pursuing conquest. Who the Sea Peoples were and what displaced them remains actively debated. What the inscriptions confirm is that by the time they reached Egypt, multiple civilizations to their north had already ceased to function. No single cause has survived scholarly scrutiny as a sufficient explanation. The drought weakened supply chains. Disrupted supply chains destabilized political authority. Destabilized authority accelerated population movement. Population movement compounded the stress on whatever systems remained functional. Each failure made the next one more likely. This is not a reset. It has no cosmic mechanism, no scheduled arrival. It is what happens when a system built for growth encounters simultaneous pressure from multiple directions and discovers too late that efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. The Bronze Age world was the most interconnected civilization the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced. That interconnection was precisely what made it impossible to save in parts. Every collapse we have examined arrived without announcement. The Younger Dryas did not build gradually to a recognizable threshold before tipping. The Bronze Age world did not send a single warning that contemporaries could interpret as systemic. In both cases, the evidence available to the people living through the early stages was ambiguous. A difficult season, a delayed shipment, a migration of unfamiliar groups from the north. Nothing that clearly distinguished the beginning of civilizational collapse from the ordinary friction of difficult years. And yet, looking backward across the full record, both events appear almost inevitable. The preconditions were assembled, the vulnerabilities were structural. The system was already past a point from which recovery would have required changes that no one at the time had any particular reason to make. This is the central problem with cycles. They feel like prediction. They are actually recognition, but recognition that arrives too late to be useful. The human tendency to perceive cycles in historical events is not a failure of reasoning. It is a property of how memory works across generations. Communities that survive a catastrophe transmit the experience forward. In oral tradition, in religious practice, in architectural choices, in the location of settlements relative to floodplains and coastlines. Over time, all that transmitted memory accumulates alongside new experiences of disruption, drought, flood, epidemic, invasion. When enough disruptions have accumulated in a culture's memory, and when they are spaced across generations rather than lifetimes, the mind that tries to make sense of them reaches for the most cognitively available framework: rhythm, pattern, cycle. The conclusion feels earned. It is not. What it reflects is the frequency of collapse relative to the length of human memory, not the existence of a governing period. Civilizations have not collapsed every 12,000 years. They have collapsed repeatedly at irregular intervals for reasons that are in each case specific, and in each case structurally similar. Systems theory offers a more precise vocabulary for what is actually happening. Complex systems, whether ecological, economic, or civilizational, do not degrade linearly. They maintain apparent stability across a wide range of stress, absorbing pressure through redundancy, adaptation, and internal adjustment. Then, at a threshold that is rarely visible in advance, the same stress that was previously absorbed triggers a cascade. What looked like resilience was, in retrospect, latency. The system was not stable. It was suspended. Climate scientists apply this framework to Earth's own systems under the concept of tipping points. Thresholds beyond which feedback mechanisms accelerate change rather than dampening it. Arctic sea ice reflects solar radiation. As it melts, the darker ocean beneath absorbs more heat, accelerating further melting. Permafrost locks carbon in frozen ground. As it thaws, released carbon warms the atmosphere, thawing more permafrost. These are not linear progressions. They are self-reinforcing loops that, once initiated past a certain point, do not require continued external pressure to continue. The Younger Dryas itself may have operated through exactly this kind of mechanism. A meltwater pulse disrupting ocean circulation, triggering regional cooling, which altered atmospheric patterns globally, which in turn affected systems far from the original site of disruption. Here is where the ice core record introduces something that should give pause to anyone inclined toward comfort. The rate at which atmospheric carbon dioxide is currently increasing has no precedent in the paleoclimate record for at least the past 800,000 years. The full span for which ice core data provides reliable atmospheric measurements. The transition out of the last ice age, which drove significant ecological reorganization and contributed to the disruptions this story has been tracing, involved a rise in carbon dioxide of roughly 100 parts per million across approximately 10,000 years. The same increment has been added to the atmosphere in the last 170 years, not across 10,000 years, 170. This does not confirm that a threshold is imminent. Climate systems are complex enough that confident predictions of timing remain genuinely difficult. What the rate does confirm is that the atmospheric forcing currently being applied to Earth's systems is, by the standard of the geological record, unprecedented in its speed. The Younger Dryas arrived without a timer. The Bronze Age collapse arrived without a warning letter that anyone recognized as such in time. The question is not whether we are approaching a threshold. The question is whether we would recognize one before the letter went undelivered. There is a current in the North Atlantic that has been flowing in some form for approximately 34 million years. It does not move quickly. It is not dramatic in appearance. From the surface, you would not know it was there. But it is responsible, in large part, for the temperate climate of northwestern Europe, for the agricultural conditions that allowed civilizations to develop and persist across Britain, Scandinavia, France, and the northern Mediterranean littoral for the entirety of recorded history. It is called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and peer-reviewed research published within the last decade indicates it is weakening, not in a model, in the measured record. The methods used to reach this conclusion are indirect, because direct instrumental measurement of the full circulation system only extends back a few decades. Too short a baseline to distinguish trend from natural variability with complete confidence. So researchers instead read proxies, ocean sediment cores, sea surface, temperature patterns, salinity gradients, and the behavior of deep water formation in the Labrador Sea. When those independent lines of evidence are assembled, they converge on the same direction. The circulation that kept the Younger Dryas from happening during a previous warm period, and whose disruption, most evidence suggests, caused the Younger Dryas when it finally did weaken, is now showing the same directional signatures. This is not a prediction of imminent catastrophe. Climate science is careful, and appropriately so, about overstating the certainty of complex system behavior. But it is a measurement. And measurements of this particular system in this particular direction carry a specific historical weight that the preceding chapters have been quietly assembling. The Younger Dryas was, in its regional effects, a civilizational scale disruption. It displaced coastal populations, collapsed food webs, fragmented cultural networks, and forced reorganizations that took millennia to stabilize. The Bronze Age collapse erased the most sophisticated international trade system the ancient world had built, and the societies that depended on it did not recover their prior level of integration for centuries. Both events were regional in their primary impact. The Younger Dryas was centered on the North Atlantic. The Bronze Age collapse was centered on the Eastern Mediterranean. Communities outside those regions were affected. Climate and trade have always had reach beyond their origin points. But the core disruption was geographically bounded. There were places that were not inside the system when it failed. There were populations that had maintained enough independence from the collapsing network to absorb the shock without being destroyed by it. That geographic escape is no longer available. The global systems that now sustain the majority of the world's population are not organized like the Bronze Age trade network, where the failure of Cyprus's copper supply was serious but recoverable over decades. They are organized in layers of interdependence that have no historical precedent in their reach or their speed. The semiconductor supply chain, which underpins food distribution logistics, financial transaction processing, medical equipment, water treatment infrastructure, and energy grid management simultaneously, depends on fabrication facilities concentrated in a handful of locations. Armor processing materials sourced from a small number of mines, transported through shipping routes that pass through a small number of choke points. The 2021 semiconductor shortage, triggered by pandemic-related production disruptions, propagated into automobile manufacturing, consumer electronics, and hospital equipment procurement within months. The disruption was modest by historical standards. The propagation speed was not. Global food systems present a structurally similar picture. 4 crop species, wheat, rice, maize, and soybean, provide the majority of humanity's caloric intake. Their cultivation is concentrated in specific geographic regions, whose agricultural productivity is sensitive to the same climate variables that paleoclimate records show have caused disruptions before: temperature, rainfall distribution, and the timing of seasonal cycles. Arctic amplification, the phenomenon by which the Arctic warms roughly 4 times faster than the global average, is already altering the jet stream patterns that govern weather distribution across the Northern Hemisphere's primary agricultural zones. The mechanism is documented. The agricultural implications are not yet fully quantified. They are, however, directional. And here is where the parallel to earlier chapters becomes most difficult to set aside. The Bronze Age palatial economies did not fail because their administrators were incompetent or their engineers were unsophisticated. They failed because their systems had been optimized over centuries of relative stability to maximize the efficiency of good conditions, and had, in doing so, quietly eliminated the redundancies that would have allowed survival of bad ones. The concentration of critical global systems into fewer, larger, faster, more interdependent nodes follows the same structural logic. Each consolidation increases efficiency in stable conditions. Each consolidation also increases the distance a single disruption can travel before encountering a firebreak. In the Bronze Age world, a failure in the Aegean took years to fully propagate into Anatolia and the Levant. Ships were slow. Diplomatic correspondence traveled at the speed of a messenger on foot. The undelivered letter from Ugarit's king took weeks to compose and would have taken weeks more to arrive. Today, a significant disruption in a critical node, a financial system, an energy grid, a primary food export region, an ocean circulation pattern, propagates through digitally connected dependent systems in hours, not years, not months. The speed does not change whether a threshold exists. It changes how much time exists between crossing one and recognizing it. Every collapse this story has examined shared one structural feature. The people living through its early stages had no framework that allowed them to distinguish a difficult period from a terminal one. The Mycenaean palace administrators who sent increasingly urgent grain requests in the decades before collapse were not negligent. They were operating within a mental model that their entire civilization's history had validated. That stress was temporary, that systems recovered, that the network would stabilize. Their history had never shown them otherwise, until it did. We have something they did not. We have their history and ours, and the geological record beneath both. Whether that constitutes an advantage depends entirely on what we do with it. And that question does not resolve here. We began with a number. 12,000 years. The distance between us and the end of the last ice age. The span that ancient traditions seem to be looking back across when they described lost worlds, risen waters, and civilizations that preceded our own. The number that accumulated enough cultural weight to feel, to many people, like a clock. It is not a clock, but it was never nothing either. That distinction between a scheduled reset and a structural one is what this entire journey has been quietly assembling. And it is worth now setting it down clearly, not as a conclusion, but as a shape that the evidence has traced on its own. What the Younger Dryas established, beyond any serious scientific dispute, is that Earth's climate system does not require millennia to reorganize. It requires the right cascade, the right sequence of pressures applied to the right vulnerable nodes. When ocean circulation weakened 12,900 years ago, temperatures across the North Atlantic dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within decades. Not within an age, within the observable memory of a single human community. That speed is the fact that everything else in this story depends on. Not the 12,000-year number, not the mythological traditions, not even the specific mechanism of the Younger Dryas itself. The speed, the demonstration, are written in annual ice layers, 2 kilometers beneath Greenland, that the systems sustaining human life can reorganize faster than human institutions can adapt to them. Every collapse that followed, regional, civilizational, or systemic, has operated through a version of the same mechanism, not a cosmic schedule, a threshold crossed. The communities displaced by the Younger Dryas left almost nothing we can find. Their settlements were on coastlines that no longer exist above water. Their tools and burials, and the physical evidence of their accumulated knowledge, sit beneath seas that rose as the ice retreated. Under the North Sea, the Persian Gulf Basin, the Sunda Shelf. The absence of their record from the archaeological timeline was mistaken for most of the history of the discipline, for an absence of complexity. For a beginning. It was not a beginning. It was a gap. A gap produced not by the simplicity of the people who lived before it, but by the ocean that covered what they left behind. And within roughly 2,000 years of that gap, in the highlands of southeastern Turkey, on a limestone ridge built by people with no agriculture and no cities, stone pillars were being raised into precise circular arrangements by coordinated communities whose organizational sophistication, the standard model of civilizational development had insisted was impossible without farming. Gobekli Tepe did not mark the beginning of human complexity. It marked the return of its visible evidence to dry land. The Bronze Age world that followed was, by any measure, the most interconnected civilization the ancient Mediterranean had produced. It had diplomacy, literacy, long-distance trade, specialized labor, and a level of international coordination that would not be matched in that region for more than 1,000 years after its collapse. It fell within a single generation, not because its people were less capable than those who came before, not because a cosmic mechanism demanded it, because the same property that made it sophisticated, its depth of interconnection, its elimination of redundancy in favor of efficiency, its dependence on the continuous functioning of systems that spanned multiple independent kingdoms, made it impossible to save in parts when those systems encountered simultaneous stress from multiple directions. Complexity had outrun resilience. Interdependence had outrun flexibility. And when the cascade began, there was no node outside the network to anchor recovery from. Here is what the full record, assembled across ice cores and ocean sediments and archaeological layers and cuneiform tablets, actually shows. Civilization does not reset because the stars demand it. There is no astronomical mechanism, no geological timer, no cosmic rhythm governing the rise and fall of human societies on any fixed schedule. The 12,000-year number is real as a distance. It is not real as a period. What sits at that boundary is not a clock striking midnight. It is a specific, documented, measurable climate event whose speed and violence reorganized the inhabited world, and whose survivors rebuilt, over millennia, everything we have been calling civilization ever since. The reset is not scheduled, it is structural, and its structure appears, odd with uncomfortable consistency, whenever three conditions converge: complexity that has eliminated its own buffers, interdependence that has eliminated alternatives, and a stress that the resulting system has no remaining capacity to absorb. Those conditions have been met before. They were met in the North Atlantic 12,900 years ago. They were met in the Eastern Mediterranean 3,200 years ago. In both cases, the people living inside the system had no framework that allowed them to recognize the convergence in time to respond to it. The hunter-gatherers who survived the Younger Dryas had no ice cores. They had no way to read the chemical signatures in ancient lake sediments, no satellites tracking Arctic sea ice extent, no climate models projecting circulation changes decades ahead. They had fire, accumulated knowledge, and each other. They adapted because adaptation was the only option available, and many of them did not survive. Even so, we have what they could not have. We have their story, preserved in geology, in archaeology, in the layered memory of the ice, and we have the tools to read it. The record exists, the pattern is legible. The structural conditions that preceded every major collapse this story has examined are documented, measurable, and in several cases, actively monitored. That is not a reason for despair. It is something rarer and more demanding than despair. It is the specific situation of a civilization that has been given the warning that no previous civilization received, written not in prophecy, but in ice and stone and the sediment of ancient seas, and now must decide what to do with it. Civilization does not fall because the stars demand it. It falls when systems cannot bend. The question, the one that does not belong to the past, that has never belonged to the past, is whether we are building systems that bend, or ones that only know how to break.